My name's Cheyenne Heflin. I'm a pediatric cancer survivor and above-knee amputee, and this is the Confiscated Leg, a bi-weekly exploration of the things that have come after pediatric cancer. I spent a full year of my life kind of calling a hospital home after I was diagnosed with osteosarcoma in 2012. This podcast is my attempt at showing the world what can come after pediatric cancer, because it was really not talked about while I was going through treatment. And as the treatment has gotten further and further behind me, I found I have more and more questions and struggles that are a direct result or an indirect result of going through cancer treatment. But before I can really talk about everything that's come after that point, I think it's important to discuss what's led me to now. What exactly happened that led me to getting my cancer diagnosis, some of the general consequences of the treatments I underwent, the reason I ended up getting an amputation and the reason I am an amputee right now, and sort of how ending treatment was really only the beginning of an entirely separate struggle to recover from the chemotherapy and all those harsh treatments I ended up having to undergo. This story begins sort of the summer of the year 2012, where what I originally thought was just a sprained knee at a summer camp, because I was not an athletic child, ended up being something a lot more serious. And that's exactly what we thought. I had been playing soccer at a summer camp, and suddenly my knee was in burning pain. I went to the nurse's office because I couldn't stand on it for very long. And when I got home, we just thought, oh, Cheyenne sprained her knee playing soccer because she doesn't play sports. But as the summer moved on, it just kept getting worse. The pain kept lingering, getting more and more severe, to the point where there were days that I just couldn't get up out of bed because the slightest shift of my leg sent lightning up my spine because it hurt so bad. The area around my knee started swelling more and more and more, and no matter what we tried, ibuprofen, cold packs, heat, it wouldn't go down. And nothing had really triggered us to think it was anything super serious until one day. I was going to the bathroom, I was in the bathroom, and I went to step on my right leg, the one that had been hurting so bad, and it felt like my entire bone was hollow on the inside, and that if I stepped on it even a second longer, it was just going to crack. It was after this and the pain and the swelling continued that we finally decided it was time to go see a doctor. We had to put it off for a bit because we were going out of the state for a family wedding, but my grandmother made me an appointment with her orthopedist. And when she took me to that appointment, I told the orthopedist all those things. I told him I'd been in pain for months, the swelling had been there for at least a month and wasn't getting any better. And then I tried to describe this feeling of my bone being empty on the inside to him, and I felt really stupid because bone being hollow on the inside, are you serious? The doctor seemed pretty sure about what it was, but he said he wanted an x-ray just to be sure. So he took me to the radiology room and got x-rays of both my knees. When we came back, he put them up in the view box, and immediately I could tell something was wrong, but I waited for him to say something. He pointed to my left knee, and he said, this is fine. You could see the outline of the bone, where the skin started and everything. It looked perfectly clear. He pointed to my right knee, and it looked completely different. There was this blur almost. Instead of the bone being finely outlined, there was this shade spot where it looked like it could have been bone or skin. He points to that and he says, this is an aggressive tumor and it's possibly cancerous. I didn't know what to do. I just started crying. My grandma started crying. The doctor tried to apologize, saying that there was no easy way to say this, but that we needed to go to an MRI that night and get seen by a specialist. He left the room to give us some time alone to process it, and the first thing we tried to do was call my dad. I tried to call my dad because he was at work at the time. And as soon as he answered the phone, I was sobbing and I couldn't say anything, so I immediately handed it to my grandma so she could tell him what was going on. According to him, he thought that I was just going to have to get surgery because I had torn a muscle or something. But when my grandma finally told him what was going on, he demanded to speak to the orthopedist. And we were left sitting in the room trying to process what was going to happen, what could happen. My grandma took me back to their house where my dad met with us before we went to the MRI that night. My first MRI, by the way. They are absolutely horrifying. Those tubes are extremely claustrophobic. And after that, it was time to go see two specialists that the orthopedist had set up appointments with. The first guy was, quite frankly, a jerk. During the appointment, he only really addressed my father until one point where he turned to me and, in a voice that clearly said he thought I was kind of stupid, "You shouldn't have been walking on your leg." So we didn't stay with that guy. Thankfully, the next doctor, Dr. Walling, was much nicer. He addressed me directly as soon as he came into the room, was talking to me the whole time about how the biopsy procedure would go, what are the possible reasons for this tumor. And it wasn't until he was absolutely sure that I understood everything that he finally went to my father and asked if he needed any clarification on anything. I remember when Dr. Walling left the room to set up our appointments, I turned to my dad and kind of just went, "We're keeping this guy, right? Because how much better could you do than the guy that treated you, a 12-year-old kid, like you were the adult in the situation and knew what was going on?" About, I would say, a week later, we went in for the biopsy. My first experiences with anesthesia, not fun. Anesthesia is not fun. I remember going to sleep, and then I remember waking up and just being completely distraught because I had no idea where I was, what was going on, where my dad was. He finally was allowed back into the recovery area once I was awake enough. And then a bit later, Dr. Walling came by with the results of the biopsy, and it turned out to be osteosarcoma. Now, to preface this, I had done what I now consider the stupid thing and the thing that nobody should do in these situations, and I had gone to the internet to kind of look up what this tumor could possibly be. So I already kind of knew what osteosarcoma was, and I already knew what Ewing's sarcoma was also, the other possible tumor it could have been. And so it's kind of painful to say, but I was actually grateful that of the two, it was osteosarcoma, because for those of you who don't know, Ewing's sarcoma, while they sort of know why it happens, it's much harder to treat than osteosarcoma is. So I got the luck of the draw, I guess. I didn't get the short end of the stick in that regard. Nonetheless, it was still cancer, and that meant I had to go to a oncologist. Thankfully, Dr. Walling was working with an oncologist at Tampa General Hospital at the time, and so he referred us to Dr. Tebby. And when we went into that appointment, I would say about 2 or 3 weeks after the biopsy, he essentially told my dad and I that we needed to go home, get some specific things done, specific tests, etc., and then immediately come in to get my port put in and start chemo because it was that big and that serious. And so within the span of a month, I went from thinking that I had just hurt myself playing soccer because I was dumb to finding out that I had cancer and I was going to have to go to the hospital and get chemotherapy to try and save my life. It was hard. And to this day, I still don't think about that whole period very much because it was just traumatic and it happened so fast. Within the week after seeing Dr. Tebby, I had my port placed and I was preparing to start my first chemo treatments, which frankly, I don't remember a whole lot of. Around that period of time, by the time we got into the hospital, my tumor had grown about 3 times the size it had been when I started going to see doctors. It was to the point where I couldn't bend my leg at all. I could not move my leg because trying to was too painful and it practically felt impossible. So they had me on pain meds not just for the surgery, but also for the tumor because it had just gotten to the point where I couldn't handle it. My dad had to go and take care of listening to Dr. Tebby give all the side effects of the chemotherapy, what could possibly happen as a result of the chemotherapy, and I didn't hear any of this firsthand, but he told it to me after the fact. And then once he had signed the consents, I was started on my first chemotherapy treatments. Now, I can't remember which ones I got first specifically, but there were 2 sequences of chemo treatments, if you will. It was approximately 1.5 weeks on chemo, 1.5 weeks off, because nothing ever worked perfectly, and sometimes you were just a little too sick. The first set of chemotherapies were called doxorubicin and cisplatin. I remember this one really well because it ran over the course of 48 hours. And doxorubicin was this deep red color that absolutely disgusts me to this day. Thankfully, my oncologist had some special nausea meds that he could put me on that mitigated some of the nausea that the chemotherapy caused. But those first few times getting chemo, I'd say the first 2 or 3 times were awful. If you've never heard someone talk about getting chemotherapy before, commonly nausea, exhaustion, obviously, because they're essentially pumping poison into your body. And then what a lot of us have come to deem as chemo brain, which is a bit hard to describe. Imagine if someone put a bunch of mental cotton inside your brain and you just couldn't think, couldn't really do anything. You kind of only had the capacity to just lie in bed and maybe stare at the TV. And that's about what it felt like. And it was incredibly frustrating for someone like me who heavily relies on their mental ability to just not be able to do anything. Like, there were times where I couldn't even, read a book, which was one of my 2 major pastimes, and it was honestly devastating to not be able to do something like that during this time where I was literally just sitting in a bed. But that was the way it went. The other chemotherapy was methotrexate, which, fun fact, is used for arthritis. I didn't know this until years later, but apparently it's used for arthritis. But it wasn't as bad. It only ran over the course of 4 hours. The problem with this one was I wasn't allowed to leave the hospital until only a certain amount was left in my system, which essentially meant getting pumped full of fluids and on top of that, drinking a bunch of water so I could get it out of my system. So that's probably why the on-off phase wasn't entirely accurate, because you had to wait for the methotrexate to get out of your system. This went on for about 10 weeks, from around September time, late September, to December, where I was finally discharged in preparation for my surgery. The surgery was going to be a partial femur full knee replacement. So they were going to completely take out my knee, take out the part of my femur that had the tumor on it, and then replace it with prosthetic components. But of course, it didn't really end up that way. I was discharged out of the hospital for about 3 weeks, I think, to recover in time for my surgery, so my white counts were back up. I wasn't as immunocompromised anymore, and I would be able to go through the surgery and not worry about complications. We went in on a Tuesday in January for the partial femur full knee replacement. I remember getting put under again, and then I remember waking up and seeing my dad looking absolutely distraught. I kept bugging him about what was wrong, and he told me he wanted to wait for Dr. Walling to come by, but I kept pestering him like one does as a child and sees their parent is concerned. And finally, my dad kind of sighs and looks at me and tells me that Dr. Walling came out to him about 3 or 4 hours into the surgery and told him that the tumor had wrapped itself around my femoral artery. For everyone who doesn't know, the femoral artery is like the biggest artery in your leg. It supplies the blood to your legs. And so the problem with that is that tumors thrive off having a good blood supply. And so with the tumor wrapped around that artery, there was a chance, of course, that it was essentially just going to get worse. And then my dad told me that there was a chance that we were going to have to amputate my leg. And I just remember crying my eyes out because back in the early days when I had been doing research about osteosarcoma, I had seen that amputation was one of the possible treatment options for this cancer. When I had gone to my orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Walling, he had reassured me that that was the least likely scenario that was going to happen. And I imagine that that is the case. It's not the most likely scenario to happen. It just turned out that my tumor was enormous. It's hard to describe how big it was, but it essentially had looked like there was a small watermelon inside my leg, and it had been shrunk by the chemotherapy. But clearly, Dr. Walling had thought something was wrong. Thankfully, they didn't just go ahead and amputate. Dr. Walling wanted me to be a part of the process. So he put a spacer in my leg. So a spacer is essentially a piece of medical concrete. So he took out the tumor and the part of the femur that it was associated with and placed this piece of medical concrete in that space to keep my bones from moving and to keep me stable while they biopsied the tumor to see if it was still alive or not. And the entire decision was going to be based off whether that tumor was still alive. I told my dad that day that if the tumor was still alive, I was going to get it amputated. Because even at 13, 14 years old by then, I knew that if it was still alive, there was a chance that it was going to move somewhere else, and that was not good. So we went over the next few days getting physical therapy to keep me mobile and moving around. That Friday, Dr. Walling came to talk with us with the biopsy results, and it turned out that the chemo had only killed the very outer portion of the tumor, and the entire inside of it was still alive. I didn't know what to say. 10 weeks of chemo, 10 weeks of feeling the most nauseous and exhausted I had ever felt in my life, only for Dr. Walling to sit down and with the saddest look on his face, tell me that the chemo had essentially done nothing. He gave me 2 options. We could go through with the amputation, or we could go through with the original partial femur full knee replacement. But if we did the replacement, there was double the chance that the cancer was going to spread to my lungs. And no one said it at the time, but if it had spread to my lungs, that was essentially going to be a death sentence. Even not knowing that, I told Dr. Walling that I wanted to go through with the amputation, that I wasn't willing to risk it getting any worse just to try and keep my leg. And so that following Tuesday, a week after the original operation, he went in, took me into the operating theater, and essentially finished off the amputation since they had already taken out the bone. I woke up without my right leg. It's a very foreign concept to think of things like phantom limb and phantom limb pain. Essentially, even though that part of my leg was no longer there from my thigh, part of my thigh down, my brain was telling me that it was still there. I could still feel my leg, and it was burning pain. Imagine pins and needles, but pins and needles that are set on fire, and that's a good description of what the pain felt like at the time. It took me quite a bit of time to gather up the courage to even look, because I could still feel my leg. I could tell myself that it was still there, but I remember finally looking at it. I don't remember why. A doctor might have come in to check, and that might have forced me to look at it. And I just remember breaking down crying because it hadn't felt real until I could see with my own two eyes that nothing was there anymore. It was a hard decision to make, and frankly, it wasn't even really a decision. Like, clearly, it was either amputate or risk the cancer spreading all over my body. But I don't regret doing it. The next few years of my life after that have been some of the hardest that I've ever gone through, solely because of the fact that I've been having to adjust to being an amputee. But I don't regret deciding on it. 3 weeks went by where I was recovering from the surgery in order to get back onto my chemotherapy schedule. During that time, I got the staples taken out of my residual limb, so that's the term for whatever portion of your limb is left after an amputation. And that same day, we got recommended to the prosthetist who happened to be down the street from my orthopedist's office. And so we were like, sure, we'll go see if we can make an appointment. So we went into this office and said such, and the lady at the front desk said, we could get you in for a consultation today. And I said yes, because at that point I was highly determined to get onto a prosthetic as fast as possible. It was one of those things where, yeah, it was going to suck having to learn to walk again, but I could walk again. Something I hadn't done since that original orthopedic surgeon told me I shouldn't have been walking on my leg. And so that day we went in and spoke with who is currently my prosthetist. Her name is Bridget, wonderful lady. And she walked me through some strength tests, mobility tests, things to determine how fit I was for a prosthetic and what type of knee I might be able to start out on, because there are different levels of prosthetic components based on your activity level and your ability. And she determined that I was more than ready to start getting onto a prosthetic. So that's exactly what we decided on. We decided that we would begin the process to cast my socket. The socket is the portion of the prosthetic that my residual limb would actually fit into so I could wear it and secure it to myself, and begin the process of getting me up on my own two legs again. Of course, after that, it meant that I had to go back into chemo treatments for I'm going to say another half a year. It was the same chemotherapies aside from 2 new ones, which honestly didn't have any significant enough effects on me to really be distinguished from the original 3. But during that period of time, of course, nothing could go perfectly smoothly. We had a bit of an incident where I ended up needing a lung biopsy. So what had happened was during the initial chest x-ray that I got at the beginning of my treatment, they had seen a spot on my lung but didn't think anything of it because I hadn't started treatment yet. Later, post-amputation, during the last 6 months or so of chemotherapy treatments, they had noticed that the spot seemed to get a bit smaller in size, a bit less prominent on the x-ray. I ended up having to go and get a lung biopsy. It was about a month-long period, including the pre-post-surgery chemo-less periods to allow for prep and recovery. It was not cancerous, which meant I did not have to get the other lung biopsied as well. That was about the last big incident of my chemo treatments. From that point forward, it was fairly smooth going, quote unquote, in terms of chemotherapy. The biggest problem was that by that point, the chemo was definitely taking a toll on my body, and I was having problems with my white blood cell counts not being high enough to start treatment the day I was scheduled to come in. So what I would have to do in that case was I would have to go home and take these special shots called Neupogen, which would artificially boost my white count enough that I could come back in a couple days, get tested, my white counts would be good, and I could start treatment. This put me off by a month or so, but I was officially done with chemo in about the first week of October 2013. But really, that was only the beginning of what I still consider the path to recovery, even to this day. Cancer was a long, hard, complicated period of my life that didn't go according to plan at all. Cancer was not part of the plan at all, but even in terms of treatment, it didn't go according to plan. Clearly evident by the fact that I have a podcast called The Confiscated Leg, which is entirely based off experiences I've had as a pediatric cancer survivor and above-knee amputee. And being discharged was really only the beginning. I wasn't declared officially cancer-free until 5 years post-discharge because most reoccurrences of osteosarcoma occur within the 5-year period immediately post-ending treatment. I think the biggest question I ask myself a lot, and I kind of get asked, is do I regret electing for my amputation during that time? Do I wish anything had been different? No, I don't. The likelihood was that the cancer would have just spread to my lungs and I would have died. It is hard, and it was the hardest at the beginning, but I've learned a lot going through it. And while cancer wasn't the most pleasant time in my life, I learned a lot about myself and my family going through it. We're closer now than we ever were before, and that says a lot because they were there for me in this time that I needed them most. This isn't the cleanest way of telling my story. There's definitely a lot of pauses and ramblings in here that aren't entirely smooth, but I think it's a testament to the fact that this whole period of my life wasn't a very easy one to go through. But I think it's important to talk about, especially if I'm going to be talking about everything that's come after the fact, because, and this is really the truth, that was the hardest time of my life. I've had a lot of things happen to me in my life, but going through cancer treatment and the subsequent amputation was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. and it deserves the justice of being told before I start talking about all these things that have come after the fact. From here forward, I want to focus instead, though, on not just the good things that have come out of cancer, which there have been a lot of, surprisingly, but the hard times that have come out of cancer, most especially coming from the amputation that I had not been prepared for at all and really only knew about 3 days before it happened. But there's all sorts of wonderful and difficult things that have come from it. One of the biggest things was that I always felt so alone post-treatment. I had a friend going through it with me, and to this day we are still very close friends, and I love that. But even so, I just felt so lost trying to adapt to recovering from chemotherapy, which took a good 2 or so years to really recover from, and to try and adjust to this life I now had, where instead of just getting up on my own 2 legs, I had to strap this metal and plastic device to me so I could walk, and learning how to walk with that, and all the other complications that come with being an above-knee amputee, which, let me reassure you, there are a lot of. I think it's important to put my story out there so that way maybe someone else who goes through, maybe not the exact same thing, but I want to put my story out there so that way no one else has to think that they are entirely alone post-pediatric cancer, because you're not. And it's important that we all recognize that so that way we don't feel entirely alone in this adjustment period after cancer. I got a bit serious at the end there, but my point still stands. The whole reason I started this in the first place, the whole reason I want to make this podcast, is because I felt so alone in the 7 years since I got diagnosed and treated for cancer. There were so many consequences that came from it, both good and bad, and it just seemed like I couldn't find a single soul who had gone through the same thing and who was able to give me any sort of advice or even just be there as evidence that you can get through the things that come after cancer. That's what the Confiscated Leg is about. Putting my story out there so that way someone else somewhere can listen to it and see that they're not really alone. There's someone out there who sort of understands what they're going through. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to take things in chronological order, if I'm going to try and theme them. I haven't entirely decided what I want this to be just yet. But I'm excited to take whoever wants to listen along with me as I try and figure out this podcast and try and get my thoughts out there for everyone to listen to. So, I've been Cheyenne Heflin, and this is the Confiscated Leg. And I look forward to taking you through the afters that have come after my pediatric cancer.